Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most audacious and misunderstood chapters of imperial conquest, the scramble for Africa. But here's the twist. Our focus isn't just on who took what, but on the one African empire that fought back and won. So let me ask you, how does a sovereign nation resist a continent-wide land grab led by some of the most powerful empires in the world? And why does that resistance still echo in global politics today? To understand Ethiopia's extraordinary stand, we have to start with the bigger picture. In the late 1800s, European powers looked at Africa not as a continent of nations, but as a blank canvas for profit and prestige. During the 1880s and 1890s, colonial ambition turned into a geopolitical feeding frenzy, famously formalized at the Berlin Conference. European diplomats carved up the continent with rulers and red ink, paying little to no attention to the people who actually lived there. Borders were drawn without consent. Whole cultures were boxed in or split apart. Now, Italy, a relatively new nation at the time, didn't want to miss out on this imperial bonanza. Eager to prove itself on the world stage, Italy turned its attention toward East Africa, chasing after colonies not for resources or trade routes, though those were nice, but for national prestige. This was about status, about looking powerful, and that brings us to the Treaty of Wuchale in 1889. On paper, this treaty was supposed to formalize a relationship between Italy and Ethiopia. But one small problem: two versions of the treaty existed. In the Italian version, Ethiopia agreed to become an Italian protectorate. In the Amharic version, Ethiopia retained full independence and could, if it wanted, go through Italy for foreign relations. That difference wasn't just linguistic, it was political dynamite. This mistranslation, whether intentional or not, set the stage for a confrontation that would defy colonial expectations and flip the script on empire itself. Now that we understand what brought Italy and Ethiopia into diplomatic collision, it's time to zoom in on the real source of friction, not just territory, but systems. You see, colonialism didn't just impose new borders, it imposed entire frameworks of control, foreign bureaucracies, military chains of command, economic mandates, all exported from Europe and dropped onto landscapes that had entirely different political logics. Let's start with Italy. The Italians brought with them a strict, top-down hierarchy. Orders flowed from Rome to colonial generals, and from generals to troops, with little room for improvisation. This kind of centralized bureaucracy looked neat on paper: clean boxes, sharp uniforms, lots of paperwork. But in practice, it was brittle. It emphasized prestige, image, and protocol over adaptability, especially in the chaos of African terrain and politics. And when your structure prizes obedience over flexibility, your strategy becomes more vulnerable than you think. Now, contrast that with Ethiopia. Instead of rigid hierarchy, Ethiopia operated through a system of kinship-based loyalty. Local nobles, called Ras, commanded respect not because of royal appointments, but because of personal bonds, lineage, and proven leadership. When Emperor Menelik II needed soldiers or supplies, he didn't send down orders through a faceless bureaucracy. He summoned his allies, regional leaders who were deeply embedded in their communities and who could mobilize people fast, often with fierce loyalty and a shared sense of purpose. But here's the masterstroke: Menelik wasn't just riding on tradition. He carefully balanced centralized power with local autonomy. He didn't crush the nobility beneath his throne, he worked with them, allowed them space to govern, and in return, earned their allegiance when it mattered most. This gave Ethiopia something rare: cohesion without coercion, unity without uniformity. So, while Italy clung to its rigid imperial playbook, Ethiopia built a system that could bend without breaking. And in the storm that was coming, that difference would mean everything. So, here's the question that stumps a lot of people. How did Ethiopia, a landlocked African empire in the late 19th century, manage to stand toe-to-toe with a European colonial army armed with modern rifles and artillery? The answer is simple, and yet brilliantly complex: economics. Ethiopia didn't just win a war, it financed a resistance. Let's start with the weapons. Menelik II, no fool to the realities of modern warfare, used diplomatic channels to import over 100,000 rifles. 100,000. That's not just stockpiling, that's strategic armament. And these weren't smuggled in through secret trails. They arrived via key Red Sea ports like Djibouti and Marsawa, through open trade deals and foreign agreements. Ethiopia was acting like a modern state because, well, it was one. But of course, guns aren't free. So how did Menelik pay for all this? By creating one of the most underrated systems in African statecraft: a revenue model. Ethiopia harnessed tributes, taxes, and profits from regional trade. These funds weren't wasted on pomp or parades, they were reinvested into logistics, supply chains, and military preparedness. In other words, Menelik built an economic engine powerful enough to fuel an army, without relying on European loans or foreign aid. Think about that. And if you think Ethiopia stood alone, think again. Menelik skillfully played the international chessboard. He courted France and Russia to counterbalance Italian aggression. These alliances weren't just symbolic, they brought in intelligence, arms diversity, and political leverage. It wasn't about ideology, it was about strategy. Ethiopia turned diplomacy into defense. So before a single shot was fired at Adwa, Ethiopia had already outmaneuvered its enemy economically. This wasn't just resistance, it was investment. Alright, now the stage is set. The treaties have failed. The systems are in motion. The weapons have arrived. It's time for the moment history almost forgot, because it didn't fit the imperial script. The Battle of Adwa. Let's begin with a crucial mistake, made not by Ethiopia, but by Italy. The Italians underestimated their opponent badly, and not just in terms of numbers or weapons. They relied on flawed intelligence and racial bias. They believed Ethiopia was backward, disorganized, primitive. Some Italian officers were so confident they joked that the war would be over before breakfast. That kind of arrogance? It's a strategic liability. Meanwhile, Menelik II was orchestrating something far more advanced than his enemies imagined. He coordinated multiple regional armies, forces that, by European standards, weren't supposed to work together. But they did. Why? Because they weren't coerced into obedience. They were committed to a shared cause. Menelik used speed, timing, and surprise to bring these forces together in a multi-front assault. Not random attacks, a calculated convergence. And then there's the land, the terrain that Italians never truly understood. Ethiopian forces used the high ground to their advantage. They knew the valleys, the bottlenecks, the ridges. Their cavalry didn't just charge, they encircled. Their infantry didn't just march, they positioned. In just one day, the Italian army found itself surrounded, overwhelmed, and humiliated on the hills of Adwa. This wasn't a lucky win. It was a masterclass in strategy, built on local knowledge, decentralized command, and a deep understanding of the enemy's blind spots. Ethiopia didn't just survive imperial assault, it outplayed it. So, what happens when a European empire suffers a crushing defeat at the hands of an African power? You'd think it would be front-page news, permanently etched into world history textbooks. But instead, it's silence. Let's start with the facts. After the Battle of Adwa, Italy had no choice but to recognize Ethiopian sovereignty. This wasn't a quiet diplomatic retreat, it was a full public humiliation. A colonial empire, defeated not just militarily, but politically. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in 1896, confirmed Ethiopia's independence in clear, undeniable terms. But the real impact of Adwa spread far beyond those treaty papers. Across the African diaspora, from Harlem to Harare, the victory sparked something powerful: hope. For Pan-African movements, Adwa wasn't just a battle, it was a symbol. Proof that colonial domination wasn't inevitable, that dignity could be defended, that resistance could succeed. It energized thinkers, writers, activists. In the United States, Black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois saw Ethiopia stand as a beacon of African agency. In colonized regions across Africa, whispers of Adwa spread through schools, churches, and resistance networks. This wasn't just Ethiopia's story anymore, it was everyone's. And yet, Europe quickly moved to forget. Italian textbooks downplayed the loss. British and French narratives ignored the implications. In the Western telling of African history, Adwa became an awkward footnote, not a turning point. Why? Because acknowledging it meant confronting a deeper truth: that empire wasn't invincible. That power built on coercion can crumble in the face of cohesion. That underestimating people because of their geography or skin color is not only immoral, it's strategically foolish. And that is a lesson too many preferred to forget. Let's step back for a moment, not from the battle itself, but from the systems that shaped it. Because here's the deeper question Adwa forces us to ask. What really determines the strength of a nation? Is it the size of its army? The quality of its weapons? Or is it something deeper, like the way its systems align with reality on the ground? Italy had superior firepower, foreign alliances, and modern military doctrine. On paper, it should have won, but it didn't, because its institutions were rigid, out of touch, and blind to local complexity. Orders came from the top, based on faulty assumptions and political pressure back home. There was no room for local commanders to improvise, no feedback loops from the ground. That's the problem with centralized systems. They can't adapt quickly. They're slow to learn and even slower to admit mistakes. Ethiopia, by contrast, was messy, intentionally so. Its institutions weren't rigid but responsive. Local leaders had autonomy. They weren't just executing orders, they were shaping outcomes. They knew their terrain, they knew their people, and crucially, they had real skin in the game. That's what makes the difference. When institutions are built on voluntary cooperation rather than coercion, when leadership is earned through trust rather than imposed by force, and when incentives are aligned with survival instead of prestige, That's when systems thrive. Ethiopia didn't win because it was wealthier or more advanced by Western standards. It won because its systems were better suited to its environment. They allowed for speed, innovation, and most importantly, agency. And that's a lesson that echoes far beyond Adwa. It challenges the belief that centralized power is always efficient. It questions the idea that imported systems automatically improve a society. And it reminds us that strength comes not just from what you control, but from what you understand. Let's end with this. Adwa was more than a military victory. It was a moral one. It forced the world to confront the myth that imperialism was destiny, that some nations were meant to rule, and others were meant to be ruled. But Ethiopia said no. No to the illusion of European supremacy. No to the rewriting of sovereignty. No to the idea that advanced weapons or polished uniforms automatically meant justice or strength. Instead, Adwa showed us something radically different. That power isn't just about guns or borders, it's about legitimacy, about whether people fight because they have to, or because they choose to, about whether leaders understand their land and their people, or simply try to dominate them. It showed us that decentralized systems, when built on trust, shared purpose, and local knowledge, can overcome even the most sophisticated machinery of empire. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed how easily history can be reshaped, how victories like Adwa can be buried, ignored, or misrepresented when they don't fit the dominant narrative. But not here, not today, because remembering Adwa means reclaiming truth. It means honoring the resilience of those who dared to resist, not just with weapons, but with wisdom. And it means understanding that freedom, real freedom, isn't granted by empires. It's asserted by people who refuse to be ruled. Thanks for watching. If you found this episode enlightening, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to hear a deeper discussion on topics like this, check out the podcast version of this episode, linked right in the description. For more videos that challenge the mainstream and tell the stories that matter, explore the other episodes here on Truth Behind History. Because the past isn't over, it's not even past.